Hi, everybody. My name is Graham Elwood. You're watching The Political Vigilante. I'm here with award-winning journalist Aaron Matei, and I wanted to talk to you, Aaron, about the significance of the OPCW report and how whistleblowers have come out to say it was doctored. And I mean, the media climate that we're in right now, and Joe Biden just bombed Syria again, right? He's bombed them twice, I think, since January. And in addition to increasing the ICE budget to more than Trump, so he's so much different than Trump. It's so great to dance in the streets for this idiot. The significance of the thing that and it shows you the crazy corporate media culture that we're in, and the propaganda that's fed. Because what you uncovered, and those people that came up, the whistleblowers within the OPCW, I mean, that should have been like the Pentagon Papers 40, 50 years ago. But instead, only a handful of people talk about it over here. You know, Jimmy, myself, my show is the 10th the size of Jimmy's. Like, we have these little followings. It's not changing the narrative. The corporate media isn't like, oh my God, the foundations have been struck. They just go, oh, well, PCW. And then, you're called a Russian agent or you're Assad apologist, whoever would, you're given those tags. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard tried to speak out about it. She was tagged with that. So where do you see it as it relates to what's happening in Syria today? And now we have the Biden administration, which has the rainbow flag wrapped warmongering fascism that isn't as mean looking as Trump's.
Yeah, well, look, it's so much bigger than this one organization, the OPCW. It really is a microcosm of the U.S. policy towards Syria for more than a decade. And that policy has been a dirty war. If you were to poll most Americans, if you heard of Sycamore, which was the name of the covert CIA program that the U.S. Waged in Syria, did you know that the U.S. spent more than $1 billion a year on Sycamore, arming and training sectarian death squads in Syria, basically? There was this myth we were given of the moderate rebels. There were no moderate rebels. We were funding sectarian death squads with a very extremist interpretation of Sunni Islam, who were, in the words of Robert F. Worth, who was one of the few honest journalists in the mainstream to cover Syria. He's works for the New York Times. These death squads were bent on what Worth calls, quote, sectarian mass murder. Okay, that's who we were supporting in Syria. And as a part of the propaganda war, because to wage a dirty war, you need propaganda. So the U.S. public got bombarded with propaganda about how we had to go into Syria to support the moderate rebels to stop this genocidal dictator from waging war on his own people. What in reality was happening was the Syrian government was defending itself against a dirty war that we were deeply involved in. And there were some protests at the beginning in Syria calling for reforms under an authoritarian government and calling out corruption under a entrenched kleptocracy that is the Syrian government. But those pro-reformist demonstrations in the media narrative got completely conflated with an armed dirty war that we were critical in arming pretty much from the start. As early as late 2011, the U.S. was helping to move weapons from Libya into Syria. And they were using the same playbook as other dirty wars, like in Nicaragua in the 1980s, when Reagan got caught arming the Contras to destroy Nicaragua to take down the Sandinista movement. The U.S. basically turned to Saudi Arabia, the great beacon of democracy, Saudi Arabia, and asked them to fund it basically so they can get around Congress. And that's what happened in Nicaragua, and that's what the U.S. did in Syria too. So Saudi Arabia officially helped pay for a lot of the weapons that the U.S. sent to Syria, but this was a U.S. program. And look, nobody explained it better than Joe Biden, who said that our allies sent tens of thousands of weapons and fighters into Syria, and the beneficiaries were al-Nusra and al-Qaeda, which is pretty much the same thing. And Joe Biden said that when he was vice president. He had to apologize for saying it, not because he got anything wrong, but because it offended, Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. And of course, Biden left out the critical U.S. role in that. So that's been, what the U.S. was actually doing. And as a part of this, to justify this whole thing and to whitewash the reality, you've had these claims of chemical weapons attacks by Syria. And the first alleged chemical attack by Syria came after Obama made this comment about the red line. He said, if we saw chemical weapons being moved around in Syria, that would be a red line. Now, if you look at his comments carefully, he actually was talking about both sides. He was talking about both, the quote unquote rebels and also the government. But this widely got interpreted to mean if the Syrian government uses chemical weapons, that's a red line. And there's a great article by Charles Glass in Harper's Magazine a few years ago about Syria. In that article, a former U.S. ambassador to a Middle Eastern country says to Charles Glass, the red line was basically an invitation to a false flag. Because if you're the insurgents in Syria and you want to bring the U.S. even more into the country than it already is, because right now the U.S. is just supplying weapons and training and money. But let's say you want to bring in the U.S. as an air force to basically be the air force for Al-Qaeda. You're gonna trigger something that crosses the red line and basically frame the Syrian government to get Obama on your side to come in and bomb militarily. So that's when the first of these alleged chemical attacks happened back in 2013. We all remember what happened. Syria was accused of committing this chemical attack. Obama was going to bomb. Remember, there was all that pressure on him to bomb. His own cabinet was telling him to bomb, but then he pulled back. And the official reason that we got was that because that Russia brokered this deal to basically bring Syria into the Chemical Weapons Convention, and Syria was going to give up all of its chemical weapons, and that was a part of it. But another big part of it, which we didn't find out till later, until Seymour Hersh, the legendary journalist, reported it in the London Review of Books. The other reason was because Obama's own intelligence people privately told him that the intelligence was not there, that Syria actually did this, and all the intelligence pointed to this being done, as would be completely predictable by the insurgents, who had obtained sarin gas, who had been working with Turkey to develop it. According to Seymour Hersh, there was a test done by Porton Down, which is the British military lab, and the sarin in the Syrian government arsenal did not match the sarin that was found in Ghouta. And so basically that's why Obama really didn't bomb it, because the intelligence simply wasn't there. James Clapper told him the intelligence is not a slam dunk. And that was a deliberate reference to the infamous claim of George Tenet before the Iraq War. So basically, Obama was saying, I don't want to do the Iraq War again. So anyway, but these allegations have persisted, and basically they make no sense. Like, why would Assad do the one thing that he knows will invite U.S. military intervention? Why would he always use chemical weapons, never against the insurgents? Have you noticed that the insurgents never get hit in these supposed Assad chemical attacks? It's always innocent civilians. Like, why would Assad militarily do that? And why would he always do that when he's on the brink of winning these towns, like was the case in Douma in April 2018? Assad was on the brink of retaking Douma from an extremist militia called Jaish al-Islam when all of a sudden this alleged chemical attack happened. And so when the U.S. now tries to justify sanctions on Syria and its ongoing military occupation of Syria, it cites things like these chemical weapons attack allegations. So even though Obama didn't intervene directly militarily, these chemical weapons attacks allegations have still been useful to sustain the policies that have kept the war in Syria going and that are keeping Syria impoverished now, such as sanctions and a U.S. military occupation in 1/3 of Syria, controlling its oil and its wheat. So that's the geopolitical importance of these chemical weapons allegations. And so that's why when OPCW whistleblowers come out and say that we found no evidence of a chemical attack and our evidence was censored, that's why it's so important geostrategically for our propaganda system to cover this up, because it sort of strikes at the heart of the propaganda that is used to wage this dirty war on Syria.
Yeah, it just seems very, that's, I'm glad how you spell that out for everybody, how the propaganda war, and it really too, it shows the insanity of, we back basically Al-Qaeda, and in some cases ISIS, who I thought they were the big enemy in the global war on terror, but now it's okay to back them against Syria, and it's just justifying, it's more insanity, and then it's fed, it's fed to the American people. And like, I'll talk to some like buddy of mine who just is like married with kids in the suburbs, and I remember when Trump bombed Syria in his first, like that seems like a rite of passage for a new president, is you got to bomb Syria. And then Fareed Zakaria says you become president today or whatever. When he did his first bombing in whatever it was, April of 2017, a friend of mine hate Trump, doesn't like him, but said to me, and I would always sort of talk to him and a handful of others, not to argue with them, but to just see how the propaganda is working. Like what this is someone who watches CNN and MSNBC and thinks they're informed, right? And Fox is the crazy propaganda, but these people, they're not great, but they're better. And he said, well, Trump just bombed Syria. He ran on an anti-interventionist campaign. He goes, yeah, but he had to because of the chemical weapons. I mean, they use chemical weapons against kids. And I'm like, wow, that's how quickly it is. That's how quickly Americans are propagandized into thinking a guy that is does not like Trump, hated him, voted against him twice. But when it comes to war, Americans have been so propagandized. Since Biden's been sworn in, I've taken more shit from liberals who are justifying Biden's actions of war because it's, war's okay when the Democrats do it, I guess, if you're a liberal. And it just seems like it's so sophisticated. And as somebody that's in this every day, I mean, you saw how sophisticated it was. And that's not just the news media. I always talk about the entertainment, the industry is owned by the same 5 companies that they own. So when Stephen Colbert has Tulsi Gabbard on his show and literally repeats State Department talking points in a goddamn late night comedy show, you see how pervasive this is. Yep. And and then, the Clinton, they can, Tulsi calls Hillary a warmonger. And again, the Clinton media machine snaps into place. Yeah. And all of this happens. So how are you seeing like these lies that have been happening and this war propaganda since Obama, probably before then, probably when Bush was in office, they've been lining up for this because it's all about this pipeline, apparently. How do you sift through this, and how do you get people to wake up to this fact when it's so sophisticated, the level of propaganda that Americans are fed?
Look, it's a challenge. Because we live in the heart of the empire, and because, these policies can only be carried out by duping the public and going along with them, we're just bombarded with propaganda. So it's a challenge. I mean, all we can do is do our best to speak the truth and not be intimidated by smear artists, but it's a challenge. And you see that, when Tulsi Gabbard, it's kind of like it's no different than like a schoolyard bully situation. Like in the case of Syria, Tulsi Gabbard was the bad example. So she had to be punished, and everyone got the message that if you went along with it, there would be an incentive. You're part of the club, basically. You're part of the cool kids. And Tulsi Gabbard, because she was speaking the truth about Syria, she was challenging the narrative used to sustain the war. She had to be made into an example, and that's why she got slandered. And a similar thing with what happens to people like Jimmy Dore or I. They can't, again, engage with us on the facts. They can't have an actual serious debate on the issues. They have to find some other way to marginalize us, to make us basically not even worth engaging with. Because if someone's paid by Russia, they're working for a dictator, you don't have to then even listen to them, because they're just like a pawn of a foreign government. They're just an agent. You don't have to even engage with them. So it's difficult. And it's weird. For a while, it was like cool to be challenging the establishment. Like culturally, there was some cachet to that, but during the Russiagate era, especially, it became all of a sudden like cool, like in the establishment's view, to like go along with the CIA. And part of that was just basically using the fear of Trump. Everyone was so afraid of Trump that basically anything presented nominally as being anti-Trump was just then worshipped and accepted. But Russiagate put it into overdrive, where it just normalized chauvinism, jingoism, and worshiping the national security state. And the impacts of that are going to be felt for a long time. It's like, like we all have liberal friends, and we all saw how the CIA and the FBI for them became heroes. And it's like they all forgot about the history of these entities. Let me say too, by the way, on a pipeline in Syria, I don't think it's actually about that. I know many people think that, but to me, Syria, basically, it's a part of the axis of resistance, which means that it's an impediment to U.S. and Israeli hegemony and violence in the region, because it's allied with Iran, it's allied with Hezbollah. So attacking Syria was a way to both take away a key ally of, these two other resistance states and groups, Iran and Hezbollah. And also by attacking them, there was no way Iran and Hezbollah weren't going to get involved. So similar to the U.S. plan in Afghanistan in the 80s, where arming the Mujahideen brought in the Soviet Union, which then bled the Soviet Union. Attacking Syria had the same impact, where it would bleed Hezbollah and Iran, and it did. Both Hezbollah and Iran suffered a lot of losses because they got involved in Syria, because they couldn't let Syria fall to sectarian fanatics, and because that would have been a huge threat to the security of both Lebanon and to Iran. So that to me was the main goal. It was just hegemonic. I don't think they're, I know it's a thing that people think, and I don't know the exact thinking of the planners in Washington, but that's my guess, that it was just about basically protecting hegemony, as so many policies that the U.S. does are.
Right. Yeah. It is just about protecting America's power, and specifically to the Middle East and control of oil. And that's their main, that seems to be their main goal. And and they feed Americans, and they've been, really strongly for the last 20 years since 9/11 and the Patriot Act, but even going back to the 60s and 70s and of feeding this. And that's why, going back to how the media propaganda, how effective it is. You even had that White Helmets documentary got nominated, maybe even won, I think, in the Oscars, which just means then it's so easy how liberals have been co-opted into this like pro-CIA war is necessary. It is amazing to me. These used to be anti-establishment, anti-war people. And I don't know how you can say you're lefty and not be anti-war. I don't know how you're okay with war. So I guess as we see, how the Biden administration is basically sort of continuing the policies that Obama certainly did, and even Trump to a certain extent, in terms of dealing with Syria. Trump tried to pull people out of Syria, and he got chastised for it, like he wasn't. And then he said, "Oh, we're just going to leave him to guard the oil," and that was like, "Oh, don't say that, Donald. Say it's about freedom and the flag, whatever, and rights and blah blah blah." How do you see this playing out?
Well, basically, the U.S. strategy right now in Syria, from what I can tell, is just basically punishing the Syrian people for the fact that their government won the war, basically defeated the U.S. in the dirty war. There's no rationale at all for keeping U.S. troops inside Syria, stealing its oil, stealing its wheat, and imposing these murderous sanctions that prevent Syrians from rebuilding their war-torn country, prevent them from importing medicine, prevent them from importing medical parts, food, making it so that fuel right now is 10 times the normal price. People can't afford to drive now. There's no rationale or reason for that beyond just making Syrians suffer, because the U.S. lost, and so it can do whatever it wants. And so when the U.S. can't overthrow a government by force, their next strategy is to make the population suffer into submission, so that maybe there'll be enough misery that people will then turn on their government, like they've been trying in Cuba for more than 60 years. And that's just because, that's why, like the State Department should be called the sadism department, because that's what it does. It imposes sadism on countries around the world who don't bend to U.S. dictates. So what will happen? It really depends on us. If you look at, the anti-war movement and the peace movement in the U.S., there was like that brief moment when we all went out for Iraq in 2003. But since then, it's been totally divided. And Syria played a big role in that. There was a huge split on the left over Syria, where a lot of people just basically took the CIA State Department line. And I don't hold my nose up at them totally, because I myself got duped by some of the propaganda for a time during the Syria war, a little bit. So it was, I get how it happens, but there's no organized movement right now calling for withdrawal of U.S. forces from Syria and calling for an end to these sanctions, which just serve no other purpose but just sadism, inflicting misery on people who have already been through so much. I was just there. I was in Syria about a month ago, only for a couple of days, but the stories I heard, everyone's got a story of losing someone to, someone getting killed, someone getting kidnapped, people having to live under the quote unquote moderate rebels who subjected people to torture, forcing them to dig tunnels, sexual assault, rape, parading people in cages. If you were from the wrong sect, people like Jaish al-Islam, the death squad that controlled Duma, they put Alawites in cages and paraded them around town, and so now people are trying to recover from that and rebuild their homes because so much of the country is rubble. But they can't do anything because of the sanctions. So, what will happen there really depends on whether there can be an organized movement. But again, look what happened in so-called left media when a journalist went to Syria for a couple of days and tried to, just talk about what's going on and talked about the OPCW cover-up. I got attacked as being paid by Russia, So to the extent that reflects like a broader mentality inside the left, I don't know how many people feel that strongly about Syria, but to the extent that that's like a prevalent thing, it's going to be difficult to build solidarity. But I'm certainly, it's important to do, and I'm not, me and my colleagues aren't going to stop doing it. And I just hope everyone catches up, because we're, once people really learn the truth about Syria, once they really come to grips with it, it will be a source of endless shame, because it's terrible. It's so evil what was done to that country, which did nothing to us, just wanted to live in peace. And they were subjected to one of the most malicious, dirty wars in history. I mean, all the US, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, with all their money, all their weapons, decimating this poor country for the price of being independent, of not being in their pocket. It's pretty sick.
Yeah, it's amazing more Americans haven't woken up to Syria or Yemen. I mean, just this like trail of tears that America has caused. And I've never been to Syria, but I've been to Iraq and Afghanistan, and I've been in, and being in war zones, it's one of those things that just changes you. And so how has that changed you? Had you been into sort of war-torn countries or war zones prior to this? And
not really, no. I mean, I've been to the Gaza Strip, but that was in 2002, and even back then it was really upsetting. So I can only imagine, because it's gotten so much worse since. I mean, in 2002 it wasn't under a full blockade like it's been since 2006. But what it was like for me was, first of all, I just was filled with anger and shame for being from a part of the world that inflicted so much misery on this country, and how few people actually know about it, and just what a crime that is on so many levels. And I mean, like, I don't know if I should say this or not, but I did gain some perspective on my own problems and how relatively how just completely trivial they are in comparison to what people who did nothing to us had to go through for the crime of living in a country that our government wanted to overthrow. So, I certainly gained, it's just amazing how lucky we are not to have to worry about, sanctions and how we're going to feed our, how we're going to heat our home, or, and I'm not saying there aren't people in the U.S. who go through this kind of problem, but at the level that it goes through in Syria, it's not even comparable. I mean, it's like, people have to flee bombings, lose their home, lose their families. It's just, their entire neighborhoods destroyed because of fighting. We don't have to deal with that here.
America has no idea. They have no idea what a war zone is like. I went through this. I went to Afghanistan 04, 06, 07 to do comedy tours, and Iraq 07, 08, and 2011.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it's like to be in combat. I'll never know, but I saw some up close shit. I was on a couple helicopters that came under fire. I've had rocket attacks. I've seen bombs. I've driven through Kabul. I've fed kids through barbed wire who ran along the side of a minefield with a downed Russian MiG from the 80s in Afghanistan. Like my nieces and nephews have to deal with that. I've seen flag draped coffins. I've seen wounded soldiers. I've seen Afghani kids get operated on. I mean, I went through a similar thing. I came back and like, God, well, you start complaining about whatever, man, like, the air conditioning in your car isn't as good as it should be, or some ridiculous thing like that,
Yeah. Yeah.
But Americans really have no idea. And even some of these people who, want the big revolution and they got their guns and they want the violent overthrow. I'm like, you don't know what living in a war zone is like. And America hasn't had to live in a war since the 1860s.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
With no idea what that's like bombed out, rape, some gang just takes over your neighborhood because there's no more authority in it. Guess what they're going to do? There's going to be rapes. There's going to be fucking public executions. There's going to be mayhem.
Yeah.
And Americans who are all like, want to get their Second Amendment revolution going. I'm like, okay, man, I hope you understand what hell on earth is like, because that's how living it is.
Exactly. And we decide that we can choose that for other people.
Right.
Other people who've no Syrian voted for Joe Biden or for Donald Trump or for Barack Obama or for the dictatorships of Qatar and Saudi Arabia. But yet all these leaders decided that they have the right to flood Syria with weapons and fighters, even though no Syrian voted for them. And when they do so, they claim that they're trying to bring democracy to Syria. What they're actually bringing is the most extreme form of authoritarianism that you can think of, which is that, not just am I going to impose policies on my own people, I'm such an authoritarian, I'm going to impose misery on a foreign population that is beyond my borders. That's the most extreme authoritarianism I can think of. Someone that grants themselves the right to inflict misery on a country that's not even in its own territory. But we just do that without even thinking about it. It becomes we've just abrogated ourselves the right to do that to foreign populations because we're the boss, we're the mafia don. Our population has no idea about it because they've been misled, because our media doesn't tell them. Our media goes along with it. With Syria, there's a million examples. Like, let me give you a good one. Like, before, you were talking about how we supported ISIS, and the U.S. didn't obviously directly arm ISIS, but what happened was ISIS got U.S. arms by taking them, by capturing them in Iraq and capturing them in Syria. And also when ISIS was moving across the desert to take parts of Syria, the U.S. undoubtedly saw them moving. The U.S. had every part of Syria under surveillance. U.S. saw them moving. U.S. did nothing. U.S. could have bombed them. They didn't. And John Kerry admitted what the game plan was. There's a leaked audio of him. And this leads to a really good example about how our media works. So there's a leaked audio of him meeting with some members of the Syrian opposition. And he says to them that we sat back and watched as ISIS was encroaching on Damascus. And we thought that Assad was threatened. So in other words, the U.S. saw ISIS moving on Damascus and with the possibility of overthrowing Assad and ISIS taking Damascus. And what Kerry said was, we sat back and watched because we thought it would put Assad in a weak position and force him to negotiate. So what Kerry's basically saying is that the U.S. was willing to leverage the advance of ISIS and threaten an ISIS takeover for the sake of regime change in Syria. So when people say, oh, there was no U.S. regime change effort in Syria, yeah, it's true. The U.S. didn't invade the country itself and try to overthrow Assad. No, what it did was it flooded the country with weapons and let ISIS advance in the hopes that there was enough pressure on the Syrian government and enough misery on the Syrian people that would force Assad to flee. Okay, so when this tape came out containing this bombshell revelation from Kerry. Oh, by the way, what he also said was, this is the best part. He says, and that's why Russia intervened. He says Russia intervened, quote, because they didn't want a Daesh government, Daesh being ISIS. Okay. So that's the reason why actually Russia intervened, according to John Kerry, not because, Vladimir Putin wanted to bomb the Syrian people and colonize Syria. No, they didn't want an ISIS government because that's what the U.S. was basically threatening with its policy of letting ISIS advance. Okay. So you have this tape, bombshell admission. U.S. was letting ISIS advance, using that as leverage to force regime change. And that's why Russia came in to stop that. Okay. The New York Times got this tape first. And when they published a story on this leaked conversation, they omitted this part I just told you about. Didn't include it. They included all this other stuff, this, relatively trivial stuff. Didn't include the fact that Kerry admitted that the U.S. was using ISIS as leverage for regime change, and that's why Russia came in. And that's how our media system works around Syria, especially. The propaganda is just off the charts.
Yeah, they do that shit all the time. They just happen to conveniently leave out this or that fact or whatever. And America is always depicted as this like, well, we guess we got to get involved in this, like it's always like there's, I don't know.
There's a great article recently in the Washington Post. It was around the time Syria held these elections. And there was some line like, the elections are a sign that 10 years of quiet diplomacy by the U.S. have failed. Okay. So that's, according to the Washington Post, what the U.S. has done in Syria. 10 years of quiet diplomacy, not 10 years of one of the biggest covert operations in CIA history, spending billions of dollars. According to the Washington Post, actually itself, not in this article, it was $1 out of every $15 of the CIA's budget went to the dirty war in Syria. Okay. So, and also according to the Washington Post, U.S.-backed militias killed over 100,000 soldiers in Syria. But now, the Washington Post, the way they describe it, it's 10 years of quiet diplomacy. That it's amazing. It's especially amazing when media outlets are such propagandists that their own outlets contain the facts that undermine the propaganda from years prior.
Well, I mean, I'm shocked that the Washington Post that is owned by Jeff Bezos, who got $600 million to hold CIA servers. I'm shocked that they would put something like that out there that's not accurate. I'm just bewildered.
Yeah.
And then you follow the money and you see what it's all about, and you see the corporate media, gets funding from whatever, the oil companies, the military industrial complex, and Raytheon, whatever, man. It's just like, it drives me insane. Well, Aaron, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show and to talk about all this stuff and really, shed light on this and a subject that is, you are one of a handful of people that are covering this. I mean, accurately. I mean, they're either, like you say, it's just either full on lie propaganda nonsense, or they're just like deliberately not covering it, and
listen, I appreciate that, but I'm very late to the game. I didn't start talking about Syria until way too late. And a lot of people before me faced real, consequences for speaking out. Like my friend Rania Khalek was viciously attacked because long before me, she was speaking the truth and just calling out the dirty war. And it's easier for me now because the war is over. I mean, now there's sanctions, and the faction on the left that like cheerleaded for the dirty war in Syria, they're a lot less relevant than they used to be. They used to have some kind of cachet for whatever reason, but no one listens to them anymore. And also for me too, I'm focused mostly on this one story, but there are so many more scandals. I'm focused on the OPCW story, but there's so many more scandals in Syria. And I hope more people, on the left get involved in telling it. And I'm heartened to see that there are, but I also deserve no credit because I came in way too late. I mean, this should have been exposed by more people from the start, and it wasn't. And so now it's just a matter of making up for lost time.
Okay, man. Well, that's cool. Yeah, we've had Rania on the show, and anyone who's been involved in getting this out there, I appreciate it. I appreciate the work you've done, and anyone who's watching my show. Some people have been watching my show for a while. Some people are new to it, so they're all new to this. There's people waking up and coming into indie media, and they're like, "Wait, what?" And it's all kind of, getting unplugged from the matrix and going, "Oh, Jesus," and it's so the fact that you're still going with it, you're helping a lot of people wake up and get the information on it, and you're doing real journalism. And in this crazy American empire that we're in, this speaking the truth and doing real journalism is ostracized. I mean, it's ostracized. You're called all kinds of crazy shit. I've been called crazy shit. And I can only imagine what you have been called. So thank you so much. And tell people where they can follow what you do and support your work.
thegrayzone.com. And I have a Substack now, which is just mate.substack.com. mate.substack.com.
Okay, cool. Well, Aaron, thank you so much, man, for coming on the show and talking about all this. We really appreciate it. I'm glad we finally made it happen. And I'm going to be doing a bunch of live shows with Ron Placone in September and October. So if we come by where you're at, I'd love to have you come to one of the shows.
I'm in New York. I'd love to see you guys. I've seen Ron perform once, and it was awesome. I'd love to see him again. I'd love to catch your set too. So please let me know. Yeah,
October 11th, we're in New York City.
All right, I'll be there.
Cool.
There.
All right, Aaron. Thank you so much, man.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you.
Later.
Bye.
Award-winning journalist Aaron Matei, ladies and gentlemen. Hit Hey, everybody, it's Graham Elwood. We are going on the road, Ron Placone and I, in September and October. Check grahamelwood.com for tour dates, probably coming to a city near you. A lot of these shows have sold out in the past. We haven't been on the road in a year and a half because of the pandemic. Come out and join us. The post-pandemic comedy tour. Go to grahamelwood.com for tickets. New cities being announced every day. Join us and support what we do at patreon.com/Graham Elwood and rockfin.com/Graham Elwood. Blockchain cryptocurrency platform. Thank you. You're making Gotham great again.